all is healed, he is clean. The priest shall pronounce him clean. If a man or a woman has the skin of the body streaked with white discolorations, and the priest sees that the discolorations on the skin of the body are of a dull white, it is a tetter broken out on the skin, he is clean. If a man loses the hair of his head and becomes bald, he is clean. If he loses the hair on the front part of his head and becomes bald at the forehead, he is clean. But if a white affection streaked with red appears on the bald part in the front or at the back of the head, it is a scaly eruption that is spread over the bald part in the front or at the back of the head. The priest shall examine him. If the swollen affection on the bald part of the front or at the back of his head is white, streaked with red, like the leopard skin in appearance, the man is leprous, he is unclean. The priest shall pronounce him unclean. He has the affection on his head. As for the person with a leprous affection, his clothes shall be rent, his head shall be left bare, and he shall cover over his upper lip, and he shall call out, unclean, unclean. He shall be unclean as long as the disease is on him. Being unclean, he shall dwell apart. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. When an eruptive affection occurs in a cloth of wool or linen fabric, in the warp or in the woof of the linen or the wool, or in a skin or in anything made of skin, if the affection in the cloth or the skin, in the warp of or the woof, or in any article of skin, is streaky green or red, it is an eruptive affection. It shall be shown to the priest. And the priest, after examining the affection, shall isolate the affected article for 7 days. On the 7th day, he shall examine the affection. If the affection has spread in the cloth, whether in the warp or the woof, or in the skin, for whatever purpose the skin may be used, the affection is a malignant eruption. It is unclean. The cloth, whether warp or woof.
We're gonna interrupt you here.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
So this has been a very hard one. This reading and this chapter and the next chapter. Perhaps we have we do have doctors or former doctors on the call right now who can perhaps throw some light on this from a medical standpoint. But it's so problematic in so many ways. And I think we start with the issue of the women giving birth. And the contemporary interpretations of this basically try to figure out why is it important to have these separations. And actually the whole book of Leviticus is really about separating what is seen as holy from what is seen as somehow or other detracting from the holiness, or moving towards a different energy, the energy that is oriented towards death. And in the ancient world, at least in those who compose this, any sign of blood is already a marker towards death, so or fear of death. And so in a way, the distinction, the struggle here between two different ways of looking at it. One of, oh, well, this is just a meaningless meaningless ritual, versus the other way of looking at it that says, oh, they're trying to tell us that we really got to affirm whatever is life-giving and deny what is life undermining or destroying. And so So when we see a flow of blood, there's a warning here. I believe that it is basically well understood even today that an uncontrolled flow of blood does lead eventually to death. So some people look at this and say, oh, well, this is all about primitive medicine that didn't really understand much and was trying to deal with it from an unsophisticated standpoint. But on the other hand, there are those who say, no, that's not really what it's about, that there's something else going on. So let's look at, first of all, the separations that come after when a woman gives birth. And the feminist orthodox author Judith Antonelli, writing in her book In the Image of God, a feminist commentary on the Torah, wants us to understand that that this is about something about protecting women in some way, and she quotes a saying that was popular in the ancient world, which is, "Baby comes out, man goes in," meaning that so this in a world where that's the case, then trying to protect the woman from having to immediately after giving birth, and by immediately we mean like that day or the next day, having to face the demand of intercourse from the man who has for a long time not been able to have intercourse with her, that there is some protection being trying to be put up here, and the protection is not being articulated in feminist language, but it's really about protecting the woman, about keeping her from having to immediately serve the man, the husband who has felt denied of his sexual rights, shall we say. So that's one possibility of looking at it. Now, Kat, do you want to say anything about the other parts of this separation of women from men and women from serving and so forth?
Well, when I was thinking about this parsha, I was thinking about, so there is in the ancient world, and then when the Torah was written and then the rabbis created halakha out of, expanded the Torah to create additional rules and regulations that are supposed to be followed. One of the things we know is that women had ways of living their lives that the rabbis then created halakha around, because they knew that the women were not going to stop doing the things that they were doing that may have been contrary to or perceived to be contrary to what the rabbis may have wanted. So I started to wonder if in this text and in some of the other texts around what we might in modern day read as controlling women's freedom and bodies may have actually been women actually, after they gave birth or after they menstruated, they actually separated themselves for their own needs. And so that women, when they had children, took their children and went away, so that not only did they not have to have sex with their husbands, but they also didn't have to do anything else. They didn't have to take care of the other kids. They didn't have to clean the house. They got a break. They got a chance to take care of themselves and their babies. And we know that giving birth and the first few months of a child's life is dangerous at that time, highly dangerous. And in fact, that's one of the reasons that names aren't given for a long time in the Jewish tradition, so that we know the baby's still alive, still okay. So in this instance, I started thinking about the fact that this was actually perhaps a woman created reality, that they were separating themselves for their own well-being and for the well-being of the children. And what the writers here ended up doing was saying, well, how do we kind of save face for the men and still give women what they're wanting and what they've done, because they're going to do it anyway. And so they compromised, if you will, by saying, well, boy children need to go back into the world sooner. And there's patriarchal issues around that, right? Like we don't want these boy children to be mama's boys, if you will. We don't want them to be too feminized. We want them to connect with their fathers earlier on, because there were distinct roles for men and women in that time. And so this was the opportunity for the boys to then kind of begin to be socialized with their fathers and with the men of the society. So I have no idea if that's accurate, of course, but that was one of the ways that I was reading it.
Well, let me add that for the boy, the Jewish tradition is that on the 8th day, the boy is circumcised. And as such, they can't be kept just with the mother. This is not necessarily a great privilege for men that men have, little boys have to be circumcised and to have it happen so early, although probably better earlier than later.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'd like to open it up now for other people to comment on this issue of
Sharon and Milt both have their hands up, so you guys get to duke it out with each other. Who's going to go first?
You want to go first?
Yeah, I really am interested in your interpretation, Kat, of the realities of what may have been happening in the ancient world, and can imagine that was the case. It's not totally unconvincing. I mean, it seems plausible. The problem that I have with the compromise is the language that is used to describe what the women are experiencing. It seems in this Torah interpretation, expiation is used. In another Torah, there was atonement at the end of the period of separation. But and offerings are necessary to find wholeness. And this interpretation of pregnancy as deficiency in some way, moral deficiency or weakness or disease even, lasts until today, through health insurance coverage for pregnancy being disease. And so it's the power of the language that feels very disturbing. And what I connected to is the growth of Judaism out of the ancient goddess-centered faith traditions, which were also centered around the ability of women to give birth and pregnancy and their regenerative power. And so I feel there is that other layer of it, a way to separate from the ancient goddess-centered traditions, which were around women's reproductive capacities.
Yes. Just before you jump in, Milton, I want to say one thing, if I may. So I've been doing a lot of thinking about and I don't think I shared this on our call. I know I've shared it with Michael, but about the distinctions between different offerings that are given and what the meaning behind those might be. So in this case, there's a elevation offering and also a sin offering. So it's very interesting to me because you could imagine an elevation offering is an offering for like hope, right? And to elevate the wholeness and the sanctity and the well-being of the mother and the child. But then there's this sin offering, and I've been trying to understand sin offerings as some place in which we miss the mark. So that one doesn't really work for me here. I don't know what the sin offering would be, but in context of what you're saying, if we want to understand the meanings behind this, I agree with you in terms of the languaging that they've used, but I think that's what I'm saying. I think that what they might have been trying to do is to fit it into the patriarchal norms and boxes of the time to both sustain women's practices that they knew they'd have a very difficult time overturning, and kind of sustaining patriarchy and also men's caring for men's egos, if you will, for lack of a better way of putting it. Yeah, Milton.
I was simply going to ask why the sin offering? What connection
Mhm.
was there seen between giving birth and sin? And why did there need to be a sin offering or an expiation?
Mhm.
That was my question.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there are current contemporary commentators that argue that chatat is not a sin offering. That that it is.
Michael's looking for the
yeah,
commentator.
let me see if I can find that.
That's what's going on right now.
Let's see if I can find it, but we'll continue the discussion while I look. But
Is it chatat?
yeah, the chatat.
Line 6.
The mother's impurity.
Want me to read it? You want me to read it just because it's hard for you? With your glasses?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Starting. Start.
Right here, in
Yeah.
light of this.
No,
One of the crucial boundaries in Leviticus, arguably the most crucial one, is the line between life and death. Corpses, for example, having just crossed the boundary between life and death, are considered impure and extremely contagious to those who touch them. By the way, this is Rabbi Shai held. In light of this, maternal impurity after childbirth comes into clear focus. The mother's impurity implies no moral judgment whatsoever. She is considered ritually impure, not morally impure. Childbirth takes place at, and to some degree, unsettles the boundaries between life and death. A new life comes into the world, but blood, considered the seat of life, is lost in the process. Since for the Torah, blood is the chief symbol of life, its oozing from this body is considered the sign of death. Although the new mother was a source of joy to the community and her new child a blessing, she also generated anxiety. The childbearing mother was particularly vulnerable and her child was in danger too, since infant mortality was widespread in pre-modern societies.
That's a very important point about all of this stuff, is that it was unusual in any of the ancient societies for more than one child per 3 or 4 births to survive very, very long after birth. It was just, and so if you wanted to sustain your community, you had to have a lot of births in the and of course, and there's a question about how clear it was that just to say that you needed to have a lot of births to sustain. So birth is connected to death. Very, very. Okay.
So I just want to go on to the sin offering here. Why then must the new mother bring a sin offering? The simple answer is that she does not. The prevalent rendering of chatat as sin offering is mistaken. Bible scholar Jacob Milgram has convincingly shown that a chatat is not a sin offering at all. The Hebrew verb in question is not a hatah, sinned, but hita, which carries no other meaning than to cleanse, expurgate, decontaminate. A korban chatat then is an offering of purgation, or as Everett Fox suggested, decontamination offering. Traditional Jewish commentaries were well aware that what is at stake here is not a sin. As the medieval Tosafos note, according to the literal meaning, pashat of the text, the mother's sacrifice is not brought on account of sin. Moreover, as we have seen, there is no suggestion whatsoever that the woman's impure status results from a sin she has committed. After all, in the Torah, fertility is seen as a great blessing and a fulfillment of God's creational designs. So there's an answer for you.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Yep.
In other words,
Yes.
it's a mistranslation to say a sin offering.
Yeah.
It's a cleaning offering.
Yes.
Which when I think about in the context of other times when the sin offering comes up, it's I've thought about it as a way to like purify ourselves from the sin. It's like, it's another form of teshuvah, if you will. Like we have to, we've made a mistake, we've missed the mark, or in this case, we just need to have a cleansing ceremony to come back. And I could imagine, like, I can remember back to when I was a new mom many, many, many years ago, that how lovely it would have felt if there had been a ritual at a certain point that where I was, adorned and oil was put on me and I was, bathed and taken care of and welcomed back in a different phase, right? As a new mom. So it's a possibility. Neil, I'm going to move on now. I'll come back to you if we have time, Sharon.
It's a fascinating discussion, and I want to check that a theme that I'm introducing is okay and not a related but secondary. You mentioned that with that Orthodox feminist Rebbe, she was talking about within the social structure of rabbinical authority, how things were framed to create protection for women. Would it be okay to introduce a parallel example here that seems to suggest possibly this is depending on how you look at it, either a contradiction or an attempt at social reforming? Okay. Later on, we learn, and most of us our blood boils when we read it. In Leviticus, it talks about if a woman is suspected of infidelity, some kind of ritual. Well, on the surface, it's outrageous. Historically, if this is a recently freed people from 210 years of enslavement, it doesn't require elaboration why this would be something in the both collective and individual unconscious. And one argument of this public ritual, which again is outrageous, why should this woman be accused and publicly brought? What the hell is this? These stocks of puritanical.
So I'm going to jump in for 1 minute because I don't know if everyone knows what you're talking about. So let me explain it for half a second here.
Okay. So
it's called the Sotah ritual. And if a woman is accused of infidelity, there's a whole ritual. It's really a public, it could be understood to be a public humiliation where she has to drink water that's mixed with dust and torn up paper. And if she doesn't die from it, then she'll be pregnant and have a baby and all's good. And I have a whole interpretation of that, but so go ahead, Neil.
So what I'm saying is that while on one hand, it's outrageous that often without just cause, this woman should be subject to it, but the social function, my understanding is the men at the time were so deeply wounded from historical memory that by doing something like this publicly, rather than hidden within the particular home, probably protects a lot of women from domestic violence. And the way the ritual is set up, and I'm in favor of this, it's stacking the deck where publicly her innocence would be proclaimed.
Yeah, I'm not going to go into that one because it's a different issue really, but it's similar in the sense of that the women get vindicated, okay, because you don't actually die from drinking dirty water, okay. So if the jealous husband brings the is wanting to get divorced because he says she's unfaithful, and he has to bring the woman to the temple, and then she's forced to go through this drinking thing and doesn't die. Then the husband is prohibited from ever divorcing her from then on. Can't do it. So it's a ritual that has a potentially protective element for women, in that most men who want to get out of a marriage will not be able to slur the woman by saying she was unfaithful. So, but yeah, but back to here. Let's go back to what we've read and say. I mean, I think Kat's point is also, I mean, as yours, Neil, very important, that although on the face of it, many of these women's rituals are ones that seem to be demeaning, they can also be read in a different way as empowering for women. And so being kept in this state of ritual impurity, okay, means that you're protected as a woman, you're protected from the demands of a man, and in this case for a very long time, particularly if it's a woman, if it's a girl child that has been born. So I mean, this comes back to a notion that we actually wrote about in Tikkun that maybe 20 years ago or so, by this anthropologist who had discovered that starting about 60,000 BC, before the Common Era, that there was evidence that women created massive ceremonies of women who were having their menstruation period at a certain time. And there's plenty of evidence that when women are living together, a whole bunches of women living together in close quarters, that their menstruation cycle starts to be adjusted to the same time, or roughly the same time. And so women going outside of the camp then was really a celebration that women had, and that men didn't necessarily like. Women having all this time for themselves, a week and a half, so the notion. So eventually, I mean, the argument that is made there by this anthropologist is that when women were deemed ritually impure for after their period for a certain amount of time, for 7 days or 8 days, I forgot on which, that this was a remnant of a previous celebration that women had, an expression of women's power, not of women's powerlessness. And just to say that there's some slight confirmation of that in a discussion in the Talmud, in which having been the practice was based on Torah was that women would have 7 or 8 days of separation from men, that a group of, according to this Talmud story, a group of women from a number of different communities in Babylonia. Now, this is after the Talmud is written after the Babylonian exile, and there are many Jews living in Babylonia, come to the Babylonian rabbis who are working on Talmud and say, we petition you to make that 2 weeks. Okay, so and the rabbi said, okay, fine, 2 weeks, you can have it. So why is that? Well, because they're not saying we are impure, we're saying we are ritually impure, and we would like longer time in which men can't make any sexual demands on us, and we can hang out with other women and be protected from the pressure of patriarchal societies. So if we look at some of these issues from the standpoint of women's power, and then why the wording here? Well, the wording is okay, if we have to compensate men for making ourselves unavailable to them, we'll make it seem as though we're bending to male power, but at the same time, what we're getting is female power. So I'm not saying this is true. I'm really saying that this is a possible interpretation of the issues around separation, and even calling something needing to be cleansed and so forth. It's another way of looking at it. So other people want to talk now. Let's see if we don't have anybody
Sharon,
to talk.
did you want
Hello? Yes,
Go
I
ahead.
did.
Go ahead.
Bay. Yesterday, I talked to my daughter in Hawaii who just gave birth to a boy.
Mazel tov.
And
Mazel tov.
thank you. And she told me that her partner's demeanor towards her changed after she gave birth. And I had read that men who see the woman give birth sometimes get turned off by that. That was the word, kind of turned off. I guess they see a vagina expand and this big thing comes out. They get turned off. So, but she had a cesarean, so I don't know.
It wasn't about the vagina.
Well, I don't know. It's a reaction that they have. Perhaps it's a lot of things. And then the wording in the Bible, unclean, that's not nice.
Yeah. So it's interesting
because they link it to disease. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're sharing, which is that maybe part of the separation is for some way for men to reconnect to the beauty of the woman, of their wife, and in a way that's separate from like a birth-giving vessel, if you will, and to return to seeing her humanity and her wholeness in a different way. So that's an interesting question that you raised. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean,
I see your hand, Sharon.
okay, go ahead, Sharon.
Yeah, the discussion raises the question for me, if at the time, though it couldn't be possible, women were also contributing to the writing of the text, and they didn't have to compromise to the patriarchy, it might have been written down differently. My thoughts about protecting women turn to my having taught 19th century English and American labor issues, and protective rights often excluded women from the workplace entirely.
Right.
So there's a danger for women in complying with protection as an umbrella.
Correct. Absolutely.
Good point.
Do you want to? I'd like to move on to the
next part.
Yeah. And
Well, what about the separation of the difference between men and women in terms of their, boy children as opposed to girl children?
I spoke about that, but if you want to say more about it, go ahead.
Maybe you could repeat it so that I so that I hear you say it. Okay.
What I spoke about was maybe it was this. I spoke about the compromise, that there was this compromise that boy children. You talked about the circumcision, but I talked about the fact that it was an effort to bring boys back into the male community, and to kind of introduce them into what it means to be a man, a male in this society, and to reintegrate them into that before they became too attached solely to their mother. Because presumably if the boy is going back and the mother is still isolated, then the nursing ends would have to end at that point, unless the child's continually being brought to the mother in isolation, which seems highly unlikely. So there's this literally physical break of connection that would be quite painful for both the mother and the boy child. So I guess in the case of if there's twins, I guess she could still be nursing if it's just a boy child. And she's going back at that point.
Well, and I'm saying also, I guess this is an aligned point with yours, is that if the mother is deemed ritually impure for 66 days, as it turns out, after the birth of a girl child, this is from the standpoint of a particular one possible feminist reading, this is a great advance for those women. That is 66 days, they don't have to deal with the men at all. They don't have to deal with any of their needs or demands. They get, so now you might say, well, why only the women? Why shouldn't the boys have that same privilege? And answer is, well, because women had, on the one hand, there was this patriarchal society, so you had to come up with a patriarchal argument, right, in favor of it. But actually, it was an area of conquest of power for women, in that in a society where women are always being subjugated to male needs, here's a period of 66 days where at least the girl child gives you the ability to not have to deal with men, period. And so you can look at it from that standpoint as a partial victory for women, not having to deal with men after birth.
Yep.
Well,
That's, yeah. So
moving right along.
So I'm kind of interested in, unless others want to, something else wants to come up, I'm interested in this part about the person who's contaminated or sick, right? Like physically sick, and they're being excluded from the community, which we could understand if it's a contagious disease that we might want to exclude somebody, as we've been experiencing.
For a year now.
To protect. Well, but when someone actually has a disease, they're excluded during the time of their disease, or when they're traveling and we don't know if they might be exposed. There's quarantine in some places for 14 days. So we can understand that. But then what's interesting is, and what's often in the commentaries read as really problematic, is then he's supposed to call out, or she, contaminated, which is like, you know, a scarlet letter, if you will, somehow marking oneself as contaminated. And in one hand, like in this light of, like, I would certainly want to know if somebody was actively had COVID right now, and I would want to not go close to them. But this could be forever. This isn't like necessarily a short time thing. They could be contaminated and excluded from their community at some points forever. And Shaya Held had this really interesting analysis of this, which is that really what it is it's a person calling out to say, pray for me, I'm sick, so I'm asking you to pray for me. And then I also started thinking about, so the other day I was walking down the street to get to an appointment, and I heard this woman, I wasn't really sure if it was a woman, but as I get closer, it was howling, like really wailing extremely loudly. It was on a street here in Berkeley, and in a different time, it would have been a more crowded street, but not an isolated street at all. And most people were kind of avoiding her or weren't near her, but there's buildings and shops. And I'm walking past, I go into the street to walk past her because she's in the middle of the sidewalk, and I'm often going off of sidewalks to pass people at this time. And she doesn't have a mask on, and I do. And so then I go back on the sidewalk and I check in on her and ask her if she's okay. But in the Torah, there's so many stories about people crying out to God and God answering. You can start with Hagar in the desert putting down her son. And then obviously in Exodus, God, the whole story is God heard the people's cries. And And so for me, this is another way to look at this, like maybe like this is a cry of pain, like it's a wail, it's a wailing of help me, you know, I'm in pain. And maybe the crying out is not only for other people to pray, but it's crying out to God to intervene. So that was just an interesting, or potentially interesting, I found an interesting twist on how this has historically been understood as kind of like a shaming and an exclusion in a shaming sort of way. So I'm opening it up if anyone has any questions or thoughts. Martha, go ahead, Martha.
Okay, thank you. Well, for many years I had problems with this Parsha because it seemed so ridiculous in so many ways. But recently, and particularly now, it seems absolutely common sense, the whole thing about the legions and the sickness, because now I see it really as ancient efforts at public health. So they couldn't know whether particular lesions were going to be contagious or not. So they had to err in the direction of being more conservative in order to protect the community. And of course, we are facing the same things today, where early on in the epidemic, there were certain recommendations. Later on, there were other recommendations, but in general, separation, quarantine hasn't changed that much. And including masks and now the vaccine. And what I see happening now, reflecting on then, is that there is this sort of friction and contradiction between the individual's health and the public's health. They don't always coincide. And what the Torah is saying is you have to err in the direction of public health, because that is going to save more lives. Having said, in terms of Kat's question about the wailing, I mean, during previous epidemics, and particularly the influenza epidemic in 1918, people often put white handkerchiefs on their doors to alert people that there were people inside who were infected and that they shouldn't come close. So I see that way. It of course may also be asking for help. We don't know, but it makes sense to me. Then the last thing I want to say is, given all of this, I find it really difficult to understand, for example, in the Orthodox communities in New York, the resistance to public health measures, the resistance and outright going in the face of all recommendations, not wearing masks, etc., not observing separation. I just find that difficult to understand in general, but especially because we have this in this Torah portion. So that's it. That's all.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
it certainly is difficult to understand, and clearly against the strategy in the Torah here. I mean, it's clearly the opposite, and so they. I mean, their arguments are, well, we do things a certain way in our community, and we're not going to let the secular society tell us how to do it. So if we are having a wedding, we're going to go and celebrate that wedding together. And if somebody dies, we're going to go to the funeral together and like that. I mean, it seems to me, as you say, to be exactly in counter to what the Torah is teaching here. And there were rabbis in the ultra-Orthodox community who took a pro-public health stance, but most of them didn't. And so there you then have to add into the picture the notion that the politics of people feeling like, in the ultra-Orthodox community, feeling like they have developed a strong identification with the ultra right-wing political forces, particularly those put together by Trump, and that in some way or other they were feeling like, well, here's the president of the United States that is poo-pooing all this stuff, and so why not go with showing our identification with him? Of course, that isn't totally fair to him, because he kept on switching. One day he's in favor of it, the next day he's against it, etc. So it wasn't a consistent view, but still it was another way in which people could identify with Trump, was to reject the public health statements. I mean, I'm not trying to justify it in any way, of course. I'm not in favor of loyalty to Trump in any level. But yeah, and it is from a standpoint of Jewish religious practice, it's completely incomprehensible how they could have done that.
Sharon, did you want to add something else? You need to unmute.
Yeah. Okay, I think that one thing that is not discussed, because I think it comes up later in the parashah, is that the justification oftentimes used for the separation is not only contagion, but sin, and that the contagion has been caused somehow by some wrong, missing the mark behavior. And I think that in part is what motivated some Orthodox in New York and some in Israel too, to continue collective prayer, because the feeling was, as I'm told from my sister who lives in the West Bank, that there was the feeling God will protect. We are not sinners. We will be immune. And many of these in Israel were actually had to be pulled out of synagogue into their homes by the defense forces.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, they certainly were sinners. I can't deny that part. But not for the reasons that they thought. Yes, it would have been. It certainly would have been a healthy thing if those who believed that sin was at the center were willing to participate in a public discourse about what sins in particular that had their community been involved in that was causing this. But that kind of a conversation was forbidden by the rabbis there.
So there's Ari and then Milton.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that I think we have several historical threads or discourses that intersect, and they intersect in a way that seems very dated to most of us and problematic. So we pull out, threads that we can connect on and reimagine in a way that addresses humanity in the way that we construct Judaism today, which is more humanistic, I would argue. And so that's the problem. So these discourses are, the purity and the impurity and the holy and the unholy and the health and sickness. And because they all intersect in ways that are that throw us for a loop, I think, with a modern sensibility or a postmodern sensibility, however you want to construct who we are today, and in our religious and spiritual lives, is really, it's challenging. And I think it's healthy to be challenged through these historical discourses, because it again brings us back to Bell Hooks's view of radical love and what that requires, and Michael Lerner's view of revolutionary love and what that requires in terms of being caring Jews today. And this definitely challenges so much of that. And so it can be useful, I think, only to that extent as a learning tool. So.
Right.
Mhm.
Thank
Yes,
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, to some extent, I mean, I'm very much in favor of seeing impurity in our community as anything that leads to destruction of human life or of the planet. So we are bathed in impurity in American society today, or I'd say globally in capitalist societies or any societies that are dominated by an ethos of selfishness, materialism, and power over others rather than of treating every human being as an embodiment of the sacred. And that's a theme that just runs through the Torah, that there will be punishments for those who are for a society that is corrupt in that way, that doesn't treat human beings as embodiments of the sacred and doesn't instead worships the idols of the marketplace. So yeah, from my standpoint, I do believe that there's a connection between human health and the nature of the society you're working in, and the nature of the ways in which we absorb the values of the larger society. And it's very hard to blame any individual because it's so deep in the culture that we're in to have people thinking of looking out for number one and feeling that their value is measured in terms of how much money or power that they have, et cetera. So this kind of way of looking at the world is deep in the Torah consciousness. And but at the same time, as you say, yeah, the language here is one that needs to be refined in some way, and so we look at the Torah and we say, yeah, this is a book that is written by people, a group of people who, after hundreds and hundreds of years of telling stories about what was transmitted to their founders, maybe Moses or the Moses people or the Moses group or whatever, eventually wrote it down. And they wrote down how they heard God's commands at that time, and not. I'm sure that if God were a person and was in this conversation today, she would probably say, "You got it wrong," or no, maybe she would say, pretty good what you got 2,500 years ago, 3,000 years ago. Not bad at all. Got some good stuff in there. And now let's make some adjustments. So that's what the whole tradition of Judaism has been ever since, is making adjustments through the kind of activity that we're doing right now, reading the text, grappling with it, and bringing our own sense of what it is to be a holy human being. And certainly one part of that is being life affirming, both for ourselves and for our planet.
Milton, did you want to say something else still? Yep. You need to unmute.
I just wanted to say briefly that an item in the chat anticipated my question and something I've been thinking about. Why were the priests the dermatologists of our ancient past? Their domain was holiness, and now they are medical examiners.
Uh-huh.
So maybe we can reflect on that for a moment and share some thoughts.
Well, like many indigenous people, we had our witch doctors. That is to say, okay, like many other indigenous people in the ancient world, people who seem to have a lot of knowledge or wisdom, and they are they are trained by those who've gone before to be healers in some way. Did it work? Well, I don't know. I don't think there's been any way to make a serious study of outcomes of their interventions, but that's what is assigned to that group. So if you think of them like witch doctors, that is people who combined some understanding of physical reality with some understanding of spiritual reality, and tried to bring that together to heal people. Well, good try. I don't know, best I can say. I wouldn't go to one of them if they had their shingles up today, to say, hey, come to this witch doctor. This is the really one to go to. But but I don't know if that helps you see it in a different light, who the priests are. The priests are, as I say, like most indigenous people, they've got their witch doctors. They've got their people who, and I mean, witch doctor is a put down term, but because actually people did accumulate some knowledge of the herbs and the various things that could at times be useful in repairing, helping people. And so you could also say, well, they are proto-MDs. The advantage of them is they didn't charge.
Or they knew how to use the natural elements of their surroundings to heal.
Right.
And so they were natural healers.
Right.
But I wonder if part of it too, Milton, is that it was the Kohanim who were the ones who would then engage in the purification act. And so they were so closely connected to one another, because it was the spiritual leaders of the community who could create the setting and the healing for the spiritual cleansing and the physical cleansing of the body. So maybe that is also part of why it was done that way.
We today, we sometimes say that we wished our doctors were more compassionate, less impersonal.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, considering that the priests had to make some very difficult decisions involving the individual affected, who would have to be away from his family, away from his normal routines, not an easy state of being for the patient. And maybe the priest, given the expectation that the priest would have a loving nature, maybe the priest would be compassionate and provide that emotional support that would be needed. It's just a speculation.
Well, it's a nice speculation. And as Kat says, halavai.
And the priests also were on big power trips, but maybe in this instance they weren't. You saying that made me wonder, how much of the power dynamics played into who they chose was, to be contaminated and excluded versus welcome back in. So I don't think we really know, but I like your generous exploration for sure.
Well, let's put it this way. These priests had no land. Okay. So, and land was the equivalent of money today. Okay.
And they had no way to feed themselves.
They had no way to feed themselves. So if they got a reputation of being just interested in themselves and empowering themselves and their friends, that word would spread pretty quickly, and people would be less inclined to bring sacrifices to the temple. So there was no enforcement mechanism. It's not like they had a police force. There were no IRS agents coming place to place and saying, "Hey, you didn't bring this one. You got to bring that sheep into the temple," whatever. So this is a society that is largely based on people believing in the priests, and that belief would be substantially undermined, as eventually it was, but it was when the priesthood started to be appointed by the Greek imperialists who conquered Judea in the period around the Maccabees, and then by the Romans, starting when the Romans conquered Judea. At that point, there was a lot of distrust of the priests, and they weren't able to get so much of their food from the voluntary giving. But at that time, they didn't have to, because they had the support of the imperialist powers that were running the show, and they could use their enforcement mechanisms to support the priestly food supply.
I joked that when we were reading the parsha about the offerings, I joked that maybe it was to ensure the priests never went hungry.
Well, okay, so I think we're.
Do you want to read a little bit more from this one?
No, you mean a
Okay.
Mitzorah?
Yeah, no.
Um,
The only thing I want to say that we read about also in Shia Held is in the next parsha, which we do 2 parshas this week, because it's not a leap year.
you want to explain that about the leap year?
So there's, there are 50, how many parshas are there?
Okay.
50.
Normally there are
50.
52, but the total number of parshiot
Is
are 56.
Yeah.
So in a normal year, which is a year in which there are 52 weeks in the year, there are 4 parshiot that have to be combined in order to have read everything in the Torah. But on a leap year, they have these other 4 to extend it. The leap year is that every several years, in an order that doesn't have particularly a great deal of obvious order to it, but every certain number of years, the is declared a leap year in which an added month is added to the Jewish calendar, and that's how you get things like, let's say the high holidays this year is going to be at the very beginning of September, whereas often it's at the end of September or middle of September, whatever. So because there's this,
Anyway, that's
yeah,
the leap year.
That's a leap year. So go ahead.
That was so this week we're reading these 2 parshas, and this one goes on more about the separation and then how you bring someone back. And one of the things that the Kohanim do is there's this whole ritual for purification that has to do with sprinkling oil on the right hand, the right ear, and the right foot. And turns out these are the same exact rituals that were done to Aaron and his sons for them to become holy priests. So it's kind of a really, in some ways, a really beautiful thing, because what they're saying is we are elevating you to the holy, to be so holy that you are participating in or benefiting from or being enacted upon you the rituals that the priest had enacted upon them to become priests. So it's basically saying to the community, yes, they were excluded, but now they are really, really welcome back, and they are getting this purification process that no one else gets unless you've been contaminated, quote unquote, and excluded. So I thought that was a really kind of a beautiful way to welcome people back, to really symbolically and spiritually and physically enact in a ritual that is reserved for the high priests of the time.
Mhm.
So I just found that really interesting.
So how about going to chapter 15, and we'll just read a little bit of that.
Okay.
Of
Let me get us.
Mitzorah, right?
Okay, let me just get us. Okay. Would somebody be willing to read about male discharge? Yeah, no one's volunteering.
Nobody.
That probably wasn't a great intro.
Okay. Anyway, it's an important reading. This little bit, just a few sentences, even. Somebody
just unmute.
Unmute yourself.
Want to do it?
Okay, I'll do it.
Great.
Haven't read yet. Okay, so
Thank you.
the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when any man has a discharge issuing from his member, he is unclean. The uncleanness from his discharge shall mean the following: whether his member runs with the discharge or is stopped up so that there is no discharge, his uncleanness means this: any bedding on which the one with the discharge lies shall be unclean, and every object on which he sits shall be unclean. Anyone who touches his bedding shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until evening. Whoever sits on an object on which the one with the discharge has sat shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until evening. Whoever touches the body of the one with the discharge shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until evening. If one with a discharge spits on one who is clean, the latter shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until evening. Any means for riding that one with a discharge has mounted shall be unclean. Whoever touches anything that was under him shall be unclean until evening, and whoever carries such things shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until evening. If one with a discharge, without having rinsed his hands in water, touches another person, that person shall wash his clothes, bathe in water, and remain unclean until evening.
Okay.
An earthen vessel.
Hang on, sorry. Hang on one second. Thanks.
I think we got enough of a point here. Just
Okay.
to just
Thank you.
Thank you for that. When this is being put into all these distinctions are being put into force, it's men also who become unclean, and unclean for a it says his member, it means his seminal discharge, something, for example, having a wet dream, as they call it, or or masturbating, or whatever it is that brings it out, including also having sex. That same thing, they're unclean. Now, the Bible is not against sex, but so it say unclean here does not mean that there's something wrong with them. It means that there's a desire on the part of the rabbis who put this together, I shouldn't say the rabbis, whoever put this together, to say anything that is potentially life-giving that then turns into not being life-giving, we are doing a temporary mourning of that by declaring that person unclean for a certain amount of time. So just as there's that happening for women with their periods, so it's happening with men with their seminal discharges. And this is something that you rarely hear talked about, but is there right there in the text, and it is as disruptive for life. Okay, then all the men who are having seminal discharges today have to go to the mikveh, stand outside, wait in line, go into the mikveh, etc. But it's not seen as something that is less than or in some way evil, or you've done something wrong. It's simply just saying, okay, we're making this separation between life and death, and that's part of our ritual to cleanse oneself from anything connected to death. And when you have the potential of making new life, and you instead spill it on the ground, to use the saying that was used in Genesis about why one of the well, I won't go there. And so anyway, just to say that it's that there's some kind of egalitarian spirit here about recognizing that men also have elements in their normal life cycle in which they are not creating new life when they could, and instead have a seminal emission. I find it really funny when they translate this from their member, okay? Because I remember, joining various organizations, and when I said I'm a member, they didn't look at my penis. But okay, anyway, they used the word member to avoid saying your penis. Okay.
Martha has something to say.
Yes, go ahead, Martha.
That was really interesting because I hadn't even thought of that when reading this. I, of course, thought the only kind of discharge from a member that I know about is caused by venereal disease or sexually transmitted disease, in which case it makes, again, all the sense in the world to clean, etc., because these things can be spread. Anyway, so it must apply to both discharges that are secondary to normal function, which is what you're talking about, and discharges which are secondary to potentially contagious diseases.
Right, but the latter case would not really be covered here, I think, because that is a much longer period of purification, because it has to go on as long as they're continuing to have that problem. So the sexual one is one. Is one that okay, you had this seminal emission, you go into the mikveh, and then you go out, and you're clean after that. Up you stay. You're unclean until night, and then you're clean again. Whereas for something that's ongoing, we're treating that the same way we treat the other sicknesses, as something that takes a longer period of time to be treated, and hence a longer period of time to be separated. You see what I'm saying? Right, Martha?
Yeah, well, I do. So are you saying that based on the previous parsha dealing with sickness, or is there something specific that I'm not aware of in Torah?
There's nothing about venereal disease in
No,
Torah.
Or any genital infection?
I don't think so. I don't think there's anything specific to that, because it's covered in the last chapter with any person who's got.
Well, but the last
It wouldn't be
chapter
on their
talks-
head or anything. You wouldn't be able to. It wouldn't be visible to the naked. You'd have to look at someone's genitalia, most likely, to see that they have a venereal disease. So the
or
last,
they might not have anything on their skin. They might just have a discharge. So
Right.
it remains a little ambiguous to me, is all I'm saying.
I agree with you.
I imagine that that's true about other kinds of sicknesses as well, that they don't fit into being shown on your head or your. I mean, it's
The previous one seems very particular to some type of skin disorder that they were afraid of. In answer to, I think it was Jacqueline's comment about leprosy, in one of the books we read, it actually says there was no there wasn't leprosy then. So I don't know if that's true or not, but there was obviously some type of skin disorder that was contagious and dangerous, or believed to be so. But I think it's very particular to that. It doesn't seem to apply to other types of illnesses.
Mhm.
So
And
it's a really
and it-
interesting point, Martha.
And they call it affection instead of infection.
That's the English word you're saying.
Yeah, in English, that's what they do. The Hebrew word is different, of course.
Anybody else want to say something? Because I think we're close to the end of this discussion.
So we teased out some interesting, from difficult parshas, we teased out some interesting conversation and questions. So
yeah,
thank you all for.
Page 69, and just symbolically close it with a page that raises some of these issues indirectly. Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu Torat emet, v'chayei olam nata betochenu, cha'aya shechina notenet haTorah. Amen. Misheberach avotenu v'Yitzchak v'Yaakov, imotenu Sarah Rivka Leah v'Rachel, v'yivarech v'yirapeh et hacholim. So those who blessed our ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he blessed
Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah.
Should please bless also all those who are sick, and send to them a healing of body and a healing of soul. So if you would call out now anybody for whom you are praying for healing.
Ava Isaacs.
Michael Lerner.
David Eidelman.
Heidi and Ed Curran.
Dean Tall.
Entire Black community. Or
Okay, say it. Okay.
the all Black communities in this country and really around the world who are traumatized day in and day out by the ongoing horrific violence.
Leonard Kurz.
Leslie Gordon.
Vayishlach lahem refuat nefesh refuat haguf hashta b'galav zman karev v'nomar amen. Misheberach Avotenu Abraham, Yitzchak, v'Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Leah, v'Rachel, Yivarech v'yirapeh et hacholim. El narefana la, El narefana la, El narefana la, El narefana la, Misheberach imotenu, Abraham, Yitzchak, v'Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Leah, v'Rachel, Yivarech v'yirapeh et hacholim. Now we go to the top of.
Here we go.
Let's do the top paragraph on that page to start with. Okay.
You can read out loud with us and stay on mute, but read it out loud in your home. Remember who we really are. We are the outpouring of God's love waiting to be fully expressed. We are the platform on which the evolution of consciousness of the universe is about to take its next step toward fuller awareness. We are the universe's best hope for bringing an awareness of unity and interconnection and interdependence. We are the vehicle through which the world will be healed and repaired. For a brief moment, we've come to consciousness and we get to experience the mystery and wonder of all being. And then we will pass on. While we are here, while we still have life and consciousness, we can praise God and sing the song of all creatures. Hallelujah.
Let me go down to the bottom of that page where it says because you gave us a good inheritance.
You don't want to kilak tov. Okay.
What? Kilakach tov,
Yeah,
yes.
that's right.
I have given you good teachings, good vision. Can you read?
I've given you a good vision for building your life, so don't abandon my Torah. It is a tree of life to those who hold fast to it, and all of its supporters are happy. Its ways are ways of pleasantness, and all its paths are peace. Returning unto the one, toward the one, in the one. Know the self as one. Renew our days as before.
Kilakach tov, natati lachem, Torati, al ta'azavu, etz chaim hi, lama chazikim ba, v'tamcheha, me'ushar deracheha, darchei noam, v'chol netivoteha, shalom, hashivenu Adonai, elecha v'nashuva, Chadesh yameinu kekedem. Yada la 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 di la lam, aya la 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 lam, aya la 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 lam, aya la 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 lam, aya la li la 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 lam. Aya la 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 lam. Aya la 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 lam. Aya la lam. Turn to page 74. Whoops. I'm not there yet. Okay. Aleinu l'shabeach l'Adonai kol, l'atei gedula le'yotzer breshit, shelo asenu kigoyei aratzot, v'lo samanu nishbechot adama, shelo samchakenu imahem, v'gor aleinu im kol ha'olam, v'anachnu korim, mishtachavim u'mordim, Livnei melech, malchei hamlachim, hakadosh baruch hu. Shamayim v'yaser haaretz, v'moshav yekara b'shamayim mima'al, shchina tuzah, v'gavei meromim, u'eloheinu, ein od, emet malkeinu, efes ulatar, Kakatu b'torata v'yadata yam v'hashevota el levavecha ay ki Adonai b'shamayim ima'al v'al ha'aretz mitachat einod. And on the next page, we'll read together in English. Starting at the very top of page 75.
And we hope
How we hope
that all the many gods of divisiveness and distortion, of pride and destruction,
that all these gods, broken pieces of the whole, will find their way back into the single vessel of life, that the one might become truly one.
we pray for Tikkun Olam, a universal healing and transformation of our world,
For peace,
social justice,
ecological sanity,
reconciliation of antagonists,
repentance and forgiveness,
joyful celebration,
gentleness,
pleasure and fun,
fulfilling relationships,
fulfillment in our work,
meaning to our lives,
evolution of consciousness,
expansion of our understanding,
recognizing the unity of all beings.
love permeating all.
May we hold to this vision, which seems so incomprehensible,
Despite history and in the face of despair,
that someday the source of all being will be the center of all being forever and ever.
On that day, the source will be known as one by all the faces of its glory. V'haya Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz, bayam hahu yeh Adonai echad, u'shema echad. Memory of all those who have in our lives who we are saying Kaddish for, and in memory of the people who have been killed, what was last night or yesterday, and
just all these
all the victims
Dwayne
of
Wright,
what?
Dante Wright, the one 13-year-old.
All the
Yeah.
victims of American racism and of crazy police and of all the distortions
Gun
in consciousness, gun violence, but also all the other distortions that lead people to act out against each other in hurtful ways. And all those who have died in the wars that the United States has propagated, and all those who died trying to seek asylum in this country, only to be pushed away and then end up dead. For all of those, we say Kaddish. Yikadal, Shemei Rabbah.
And obviously add in any names of the chat of anyone you're saying Kaddish for.
Yes, okay. V'alma divrach chirutzei v'yamlich malchutei. V'chayechon v'yamechon v'chayed v'chol Beyt Yisrael. Ba'agala u'bizman kari v'imru amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevorach le'olam olamei amaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shmei dekudsha b'richu. Le'ela mikol birchata v'shirata. Tush bechata v'nechemata. Da'amiran be'alma v'imru.
Amen.
Yehei shloma Rabbah min shemaya. V'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru.
Amen.
Oseh shalom b'mromav. Huyaseh shalom. Leinu v'al kol Yisrael. V'al kol yoshvei tevel v'imru. Amen. And now we'll do the Kiddush. From Kaddish to Kiddush. V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat le'dorotam berit olam. V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat dorotam berit olam. Ve'nu v'bnei Yisrael oti le'olam, oti le'olam. V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot ha-Shabbat le'dorotam berit olam. Ki sheshet yamim asa Adonai et ha-shamayim et ha'aretz v'shamru b'nei Yisrael ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat le'dorotam berit olam. U'bayom hashvi'i Shabbat vayinafash, Shabbat vayinafash, Shabbat vayinafash. V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat le'dorotam berit olam. Remember the seventh day to keep it holy. 6 days you should do all your work and labor. On the seventh day is the Shabbos to God. On it you should do no work.
Nope.
Neither you,
Or anyone in your home,
nor anybody visiting, nor any of your animals, nor anybody who works for you. For in 6 days God made heaven and earth,
the
sea
sea
and all that is within it. And on the seventh day she rested Therefore, God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. Came berach Adonai et Yom HaShabbat v'yikadshehu. Savri Baruch et Adonai Eloheinu melech olam borei peri hagafen. L'chaim, l'chaim. And we're going to wash for the meal we're about to have. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. 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 Ay, 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 ay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al netilat yadayim.
May the work of our hands reflect the handiwork of the divine.
Amen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Amen.
Good Shabbos, everyone. Stop screen sharing.
Shabbat shalom.
Good Shabbos.
Shabbat shalom.
Shalom. Shabbat, 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 Shalom.
Shabbat
Shabbat, Shalom. Hey, Shabbat, Shalom. Hey, Shabbat, 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 Shalom.
Shabbat
Shabbat, Shabbat,
Shabbat
Shabbat, Shabbat, Shalom. Shabbat, 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 Shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Good Shabbos. Shabbat
Shabbat,
shalom.
Shalom. Shabbat, 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 Shalom.
Thank you for
Thank
being
you.
with us.
Thank you very much.
Mute and say
And you
hello
for
if you
being
want to.
here.
Mhm.
Thanks for being here, everyone.
Mhm.
Great to see you.
Good to see you too.
Nice to see you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Shabbat shalom, everybody.
Michael Kramer, it's good to see you.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank
Everybody,
you.
very good to see everybody. Mm.
Many blessings, everyone.
You too, Carol.